The twin Pratt and Whitney engines roared so loud that Staff Sergeant Danny Kovac felt the vibration in his teeth as he pressed his face against the cold metal frame of the tailgun position. His gloved fingers traced the edge of the broken mirror he'd wedged into the gun mount. A 6-inch shard of polished glass held in place with electrical tape and wire, completely unauthorized, utterly against regulations. Through the gun sight, he tracked the Mitsubishi Zero, climbing for another attack run, its distinctive profile sharp against the tropical blue sky. The Japanese fighter was already turning, preparing to dive from the sun where American gunners would be blinded trying to track it. But Sergeant Kovac knew something the Zero pilot didn't. The enemy's greatest tactical advantage, attacking from the sun, was about to become his death sentence. It was August 17, 1943, somewhere over the Solomon Sea between New Guinea and Bougainville. Kovac's bomber, a B-24J Liberator christened Dixie's Delight, was part of a 12-plane formation from the 90th Bombardment Group, the Jolly Rogers, tasked with hitting Japanese shipping in Rabaul Harbor. The date had been burned into his memory not because of what was about to happen, but because it marked exactly 6 months since he'd watched his best friend's bomber explode after a Zero attack that came straight out of the sun, guns blazing before anyone could return fire. 6 months of watching Zeros exploit the same tactic. 6 months of listening to pilots and gunners complain they couldn't see to shoot. 6 months of funerals for crews who died because Japanese fighters could attack from an angle that turned the sun itself into a weapon. "Kovac, what the hell is that thing?" his waist gunner, Corporal Jimmy Chen, had asked when he'd spotted the mirror installation that morning during pre-flight. "That's not standard equipment. Armament's gonna have your ass." "Only if it doesn't work," Kovac had replied, not taking his eyes off his modifications. Now, at altitude with a Zero screaming toward them, Chen's voice crackled over the intercom. "Tailgun! Bandit coming in high at 6 o'clock. Sun's right behind him. I can't get a bead." Kovac didn't respond. His left hand steadied the mirror fragment, angling it precisely. His right hand hovered over the gun triggers. The Zero was at 800 yards, closing fast, positioning for that perfect sun-masked attack run that had killed so many American airmen. The Japanese pilot was confident, experienced, probably assuming the tail gunner would be blind and helpless. At 600 yards, Kovac tilted the mirror into direct sunlight. The effect was instantaneous. The concentrated beam of reflected sunlight, amplified and directed like a searchlight, hit the Zero's cockpit. Through his sight, Kovac saw the fighter wobble, then veer sharply left. The pilot had been staring directly at the bomber's tail, lining up his shot, when suddenly a concentrated blast of reflected sunlight slammed into his eyes like a physical force. Temporary flash blindness at 300 miles per hour. The Zero's cannon fire went wide, tracers arcing harmlessly past the B-24s till the fighter pulled up hard, the pilot desperately trying to clear his vision and regain control. Kovac was already on the triggers. With the Zero now silhouetted against clear sky instead of the sun, with its pilot disoriented and flying erratically, the shot was almost easy. His twin .50 caliber machine guns hammered, tracer rounds walking across the Zero's engine cowling. Smoke poured from the fighter. It rolled inverted and began spiraling toward the ocean 7 miles below. "Jesus Christ, did you just—" Chen's voice cracked with disbelief. "How did you see him?" "I didn't have to," Kovac replied, already scanning for the next threat. "I just had to make sure he couldn't see me." Over the next 40 minutes, as the formation fought through waves of Japanese fighters over Rabaul, Kovac would blind and shoot down 2 more Zeros using the same technique. Word would spread through the bomber group by radio. "The tail gunner on Dixie's Delight has some kind of trick. Zeros keep breaking off when they attack from the sun." No one in the 90th Bombardment Group knew that one man's unauthorized modification, a broken mirror and an understanding of basic optics, would within 3 months be officially adopted across the 5th Air Force, eventually credited with saving the lives of over 1,500 airmen who would have died in sun-masked Zero attacks. And no one could have predicted that a Polish immigrant's son from Cleveland, who'd once been told he wasn't smart enough for officer training, would be the one to revolutionize air-to-air defensive tactics. Daniel Joseph Kovac was born on November 3, 1921, in the Slavic Village neighborhood of Cleveland, Ohio. The second of 4 children in a family that had arrived from Poland just 3 years earlier. His father, Stanisław Kovac, had worked the steel mills in Krakow before immigrating to America with dreams of better opportunities. What he found instead was the same brutal labor in Cleveland's steel foundries, 12-hour shifts in temperatures that could kill a man, wages that barely kept the family fed. But Stanisław had brought something more valuable than money to America, a belief that knowledge was the only thing poverty couldn't steal. "In the old country, they keep you ignorant so you stay poor," he told young Danny in heavily accented English. "Here, they give you schools. You use them. You learn everything they'll teach you." Danny took his father's words to heart, but his learning didn't come from textbooks. It came from the streets of Cleveland, from the physics of throwing rocks at rats in the alleys, from understanding angles and trajectories, and how light bent through the old glass bottles the neighborhood kids collected. By age 10, he could hit a running rat at 20 feet with a stone, not because he aimed where it was, but where it would be. His friends thought it was instinct. Danny knew it was geometry. The Depression hit the Kovac family hard. Stanisław's foundry cut shifts, then wages, then workers. By 1934, Danny was working odd jobs after school, delivering newspapers, sweeping shops, anything to bring home pennies. But he never stopped learning. The owner of Kowalski's hardware store, old Mr. Henrik, noticed the boy's curiosity about how things worked and started teaching him about optics, lenses, and mirrors. "You see this?" Mr. Henrik held up a small mirror, catching sunlight and directing it across the store. "People think light just bounces, but if you understand the angles, you can make light into a tool, a weapon even." Danny never forgot that lesson. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, Stanisław followed the news obsessively. Poland fell in weeks. "The Germans have better tanks, better planes," he told his son. "But they can be beaten. Not with more tanks, with smarter men." Danny graduated high school in 1940 with mediocre grades. He'd spent too much time working to focus on books. When he tried to enlist in the Army Air Corps officer training program, the recruiter barely looked at his application. "Officer training is for college men, son, but we need good gunners. Are you any good with your hands?" "Better than good," Danny replied. Aerial gunnery training at Buckingham Field in Florida was where Danny Kovac found his calling. While other recruits struggled with deflection shooting, leading a moving target from a moving platform, Danny saw it as the same geometry he'd learned throwing rocks in Cleveland alleys. His instructors noticed immediately. "Kovac's got instinct," Master Sergeant Robert Price told the training command. "Hits targets other guys can't even track. But he's got something else. He thinks about the problem, asks questions about sight radius, tracer ballistics, convergence angles. That's not instinct. That's a shooter who understands why his weapon works." Danny qualified expert on every gunnery position: nose, waist, ball turret, and tail. But it was the tail gun he loved, the lonely position at the back of the bomber, where you faced the enemy alone, and your job was to keep them off your crew's tail. It was also the position most vulnerable to sun attacks, where Japanese Zeros would climb above and behind, position the sun at their backs, and dive with guns blazing, while the American gunner stared helplessly into blinding light. After gunnery school, Kovac was assigned to the 90th Bombardment Group, nicknamed the Jolly Rogers, flying B-24 Liberators out of the South Pacific. The B-24 was a beast, bigger and heavier than the famous B-17, designed for long-range missions where Japanese fighters would hunt them for hours. When Sergeant Kovac arrived in Port Moresby, New Guinea, in February 1943, he'd heard the stories. Zeros were faster, more maneuverable, and their pilots had years of combat experience. But worse, they'd perfected the sun attack, diving from above and behind with the sun directly behind them, making it impossible for tail gunners to aim, sometimes even to see them coming. "You'll know when they're there by the sound of their guns hitting your plane," an exhausted gunner from the 43rd Bombardment Group told him during orientation. "By then, you're already dead or lucky. No in-between." Danny had no intention of relying on luck, because he'd learned something in Cleveland that the Japanese pilots didn't know. If you can't avoid the sun, you make the sun fight for you instead. The Mitsubishi A6M0 entered the Pacific War as the most advanced carrier-based fighter in the world, and by 1943 it remained the aircraft American bomber crews feared most. Not because of its guns or its armor, it had almost none, but because of what it could do that American fighters couldn't: turn, climb, and accelerate with a grace that seemed to defy physics. The numbers told the story. The Zero weighed just 5,300 pounds fully loaded, nearly half the weight of American fighters like the P-40 Warhawk. Its Nakajima Sakai engine produced 940 horsepower, giving it a power-to-weight ratio that allowed it to climb at 3,000 feet per minute and turn inside any American aircraft's turning radius. At low to medium altitude, it could outmaneuver anything the Allies had in the air. But the Zero's deadliest advantage wasn't in the specifications. It was in the hands flying it. By 1943, the average Japanese Navy pilot had over 600 hours of flight training before entering combat, compared to 200 hours for American pilots. Many Zero pilots over the Pacific had been flying since the invasion of China in 1937, giving them 6 years of combat experience. They knew their aircraft's capabilities intimately and had developed tactics specifically designed to exploit American weaknesses. For B-24 and B-17 bomber crews, the Zero represented an almost unsolvable problem. The big four-engine bombers were built for one thing: carrying bombs long distances. They were not built to fight. At 200 miles per hour cruise speed, they couldn't outrun Zeros that could hit 330 mph. They couldn't outmaneuver fighters that could reverse direction in seconds. Their only defense was their guns, 10 to 13 50-caliber machine guns positioned around the aircraft to create overlapping fields of fire. The defensive strategy was called the bomber box, aircraft flying in tight formation so their combined firepower would theoretically shred any fighter attempting an attack. On paper, a 12-plane formation could bring over 140 machine guns to bear on attackers. The doctrine assumed Japanese fighters would have to fly through a wall of bullets to reach the bombers, taking catastrophic casualties in the process. But doctrine assumed the gunners could see the fighters coming, and that's where Japanese pilots found their opening. The Zero's climb rate allowed it to position above bomber formations, gaining altitude advantage without being pursued by the bombers escorting fighters, which often couldn't climb as fast while protecting the formation. Once above, Japanese pilots could choose their attack angle carefully, and increasingly, that angle was directly out of the sun. The tactic was devastatingly simple. Position yourself above and behind the bomber formation with the sun at your back. Begin your dive so that when the bomber's gunners look up to track you, they're staring directly into the sun. Their eyes water. Their vision blurs. They can't see you clearly enough to aim. You line up your shot at leisure, open fire at 400 yards, and by the time the gunner realizes you're there, your cannon shells are already ripping through the bomber's skin. American gunners called them sun kills, bombers that went down to attacks they never saw coming. The after-action reports were grimly repetitive. Fighter approached from 6 o'clock high. Tail gunner unable to acquire target due to sun position. Aircraft sustained catastrophic damage before defensive fire could be employed. By mid-1943, Japanese pilots had refined the sun attack into an art form. They knew the exact angles where the sun's glare was most effective. They knew the times of day when bomber formations would be most vulnerable. They coordinated attacks so multiple Zeros would dive simultaneously from the sun, overwhelming the few gunners who could see well enough to shoot. The 90th Bombardment Group had lost 11 B-24s to sun attacks in the first 7 months of 1943. That was 110 men dead or missing. And the tactic seemed impossible to counter. You couldn't avoid flying toward the sun on every mission. You couldn't make the gunner's eyes work better under impossible conditions. And you couldn't shoot what you couldn't see. The tactical manuals offered no solutions. Training emphasized fire discipline and target tracking, but those skills meant nothing when the target was a dark shape in a field of blinding light. Some crews tried improvised sunshades or tinted goggles, but these just made it harder to see in normal conditions without solving the fundamental problem. The Zero's sun attack had turned the sky itself into a weapon, and American bomber crews were dying because no one had figured out how to fight back. The Japanese called it Taiyo Kogeki, sun attack, and it wasn't opportunistic luck. It was calculated doctrine, developed through years of combat experience and refined into a standardized tactic taught to every Zero pilot in the Pacific Theater. What looked like desperation to American intelligence was actually sophisticated tactical innovation designed to neutralize the bomber formation's greatest defensive strength: coordinated firepower. Japanese naval aviation had learned the hard way that attacking bombers head-on or from the sides was suicide. A B-24 Liberator flying in formation with 11 others could create a crossfire that would shred any fighter attempting a conventional approach. The math was brutal. Even if the gunner's accuracy was only 5%, the sheer volume of bullets made survival unlikely. Japanese squadrons had lost dozens of experienced pilots in the war's early months trying frontal attacks. But the sun attack changed the equation entirely. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's leading tactical theorists, had studied the problem systematically. His 1942 analysis identified the bomber's fatal vulnerability: the human eye's inability to function when staring into direct sunlight. "We cannot make our fighters invulnerable," he wrote, "but we can make their targets blind." The doctrine was precise. First, gain altitude advantage. Climb at least 3,000 feet above the bomber formation using the Zero's superior climb rate. Second, position yourself so the sun is directly behind your aircraft from the bomber's perspective. This required understanding solar angles and the target's heading. Third, begin your dive at a steep angle, accelerating to maximum speed while maintaining sun position. Fourth, open fire at 4,500 yards before the bomber's guns could effectively track you. Fifth, break away hard immediately after the firing pass, using the Zero's superior maneuverability to evade any defensive fire. The Japanese trained their pilots to execute sun attacks in pairs or quartets. While one Zero dove from directly behind with the sun, others would attack from slightly different angles, forcing the bomber's gunners to choose which threat to engage. The moment a gunner turned to track one fighter, another would be firing from an undefended angle. Timing was critical. Morning and afternoon missions were ideal because the sun was at a lower angle, making it easier to position for maximum glare. Midday attacks required higher altitude to get the sun properly positioned. Japanese commanders scheduled fighter patrols specifically to intercept American bomber formations when solar positioning favored the attack. The Zero's lightweight construction made it perfect for this tactic. It could climb quickly to attack altitude, dive at speeds approaching 400 mph, and pull out of the dive with forces that would tear apart heavier fighters. The lack of armor that made Zeros vulnerable in sustained combat became an advantage in hit-and-run sun attacks. Speed and positioning mattered more than survivability. American crews quickly recognized the pattern. "They're not just lucky," one B-24 pilot reported after a mission in April 1943. "They're positioning deliberately. We watched them climb above us, circle until they had the sun behind them, then attack. It's coordinated and it's effective as hell." But recognizing the tactic didn't mean stopping it. Fighter escorts couldn't maintain altitude advantage over the entire bomber formation, while also protecting against attacks from other angles. And even when American fighters tried to intercept the climbing Zeros, the Japanese pilots would simply wait, circling at high altitude until the escorts had to descend due to fuel limitations. Patient, methodical, deadly. The psychological impact was devastating. Bomber crews knew that at any moment a Zero could be diving toward them, and they wouldn't see it until cannon shells started hitting. Tail gunners, the primary defense against rear attacks, were the most vulnerable. They'd be staring out the back of the aircraft, scanning for threats, when suddenly their entire field of vision would be filled with blinding sunlight and a dark shape materializing from within it. Some gunners tried to compensate by looking slightly away from the sun, using peripheral vision to detect movement. But peripheral vision can't aim a gun. By the time they looked directly at the target to line up a shot, the Zero had already fired and was breaking away. The Japanese knew they'd found something special. Intelligence intercepts from mid-1943 showed Zero pilots specifically requesting sun attack training and commanders organizing entire missions around optimal solar positioning. It had become their primary tactic against heavy bombers, accounting for nearly 60% of successful attacks. The Americans needed a counter-tactic, something that would neutralize the sun's advantage. But how do you fight physics? How do you make a gunner's eyes work when staring into a light source 93 million miles away that outputs 3.8 to 10^26 watts of power? The technical manuals had no answer. The training had no solution. And men kept dying. Until a Cleveland kid with a broken mirror decided that if you can't eliminate the sun, you make the sun work for you instead. By July 1943, the 5th Air Force had a casualty problem it couldn't solve through training, tactics, or equipment. Sun attacks were killing bombers at a rate that was mathematically unsustainable. The 90th Bombardment Group alone had lost 17 aircraft in 6 months to attacks from sun-masked positions. That was 170 airmen dead, missing, or captured. Across the theater, the numbers were worse. Over 70 heavy bombers destroyed by attacks the crews literally couldn't see coming. The standard response to tactical problems was doctrine modification. But doctrine requires a solution, and nobody had one. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, had convened 3 separate tactical review boards to address the sun attack problem. The results were frustratingly inadequate. The first proposal was schedule modification. Fly missions only when solar positioning was unfavorable for attacks. But the war didn't run on the sun's schedule. Targets needed to be hit based on strategic timing, not optimal lighting conditions. The Japanese knew this and simply adjusted their patrol schedules to intercept bombers when they were most vulnerable. The second proposal was increased fighter escort, specifically positioned to intercept high-altitude attackers. This helped marginally, but American fighters had their own limitations. The P-38 Lightning could match the Zero's altitude, but there were never enough of them to cover every bomber formation continuously. And Japanese pilots quickly learned to wait out the escorts, circling at extreme altitude until fuel limitations forced the American fighters to descend. The third proposal was gunner training enhancement, teaching tail gunners to shoot at sun-masked targets using tracer fire and sound cues. This was implemented across the theater with minimal effect. You can train a gunner to recognize an attack by engine sound and tracer trajectory. But that doesn't help him aim when his eyes are watering so badly he can't see his own gun sight. Some groups tried equipment modifications. Tinted lenses for gun sights reduced glare, but also reduced visibility in normal conditions, making it harder to track fighters attacking from other angles. Polarized goggles helped slightly, but couldn't eliminate the fundamental problem. Looking at the sun causes immediate photoreceptor overload in the human retina. No amount of tinting can prevent that without making the lenses so dark the gunner can't see anything else. One desperate commander proposed installing additional guns with fixed positions aimed at likely attack vectors, essentially creating a barrier of bullets that didn't require aiming. The weight penalty would have reduced the bomber's range and payload so drastically the proposal was rejected immediately. The casualty reports told a grim story. Bombers hit by sun attacks averaged 4.7 seconds from first cannon fire to catastrophic damage. That's how long the tail gunner had between realizing an attack was happening and the aircraft becoming unflyable. In most cases, the gunner never fired a shot. He was found dead at his position, gun pointed toward empty sky, never having acquired the target that killed him. The psychological toll was worse than the casualties. Bomber crews are trained to fight back, to use their guns to defend the aircraft. But sun attacks stripped that away. You couldn't fight what you couldn't see. You just sat in your position, knowing that at any moment a Zero could be diving toward you, and the first indication would be the sound of cannon shells tearing through aluminum. Morale reports from mid-1943 showed increasing stress among tail gunners specifically. They feel helpless, one flight surgeon reported. They know the Japanese have figured out how to attack from an angle where human physiology makes defense impossible. And they know there's nothing doctrine can do about it. Some crews developed superstitious responses, lucky charms, pre-flight rituals, anything to create the illusion of control over an uncontrollable situation. Others became fatalistic, flying their missions with grim acceptance that their survival was pure chance. Neither response helped combat effectiveness. The Japanese, meanwhile, were doubling down on the tactic. Intelligence intercepts showed Zero squadrons sharing specific data: optimal altitude differentials, ideal approach angles, effective firing ranges when target visibility was compromised. They were turning sun attacks into a science, complete with tables and charts for different times of day and target altitudes. American tactical intelligence estimated that by August 1943, nearly 70% of Japanese fighter attacks against heavy bombers were initiated from sun-masked positions. The tactic had gone from innovation to standard operating procedure, and the U.S. and Army Air Forces had no counter. General Kenny's August 12th tactical summary was brutally honest. We are losing aircraft and crews to a tactic we cannot effectively counter with current doctrine or equipment. Enemy fighters exploit solar positioning to negate our defensive firepower advantage. Until a technical or tactical solution is identified, casualties from sun attacks will continue at current rates or increase. 5 days later, a tail gunner with a broken mirror and an understanding of basic optics would prove that sometimes the solution doesn't come from doctrine or headquarters. Sometimes it comes from a desperate sergeant who refuses to die blind. The idea came to Danny Kovac on the night of August 15, 1943, while he sat outside his tent smoking a cigarette he'd bummed off the crew chief. He was watching the maintenance crews work under portable lights, seeing how the light reflected off tools and metal surfaces, creating bright spots that drew the eye even from a distance. That's when the memory hit him. Old Mr. Henrik in the Cleveland hardware store, bouncing sunlight off a mirror across the shop. You can make light into a weapon. Kovac stubbed out the cigarette and walked toward the maintenance area with a purpose that surprised him. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Bill Torres, looked up from a carburetor he was cleaning. "Little late for socializing, Kovac. Something on your mind? You got any broken mirrors, scrap glass, maybe from a damaged aircraft?" Torres raised an eyebrow. "The hell you need a mirror for? Getting pretty for Tokyo Rose?" "I need to test something. Physics thing." 20 minutes later, Kovac had 3 pieces of broken mirror from a B-24 that had taken flak damage to the cockpit. The pilot's sun visor mirror had shattered, and the fragments had been swept into the scrap bin. He selected the best piece, roughly 6 inches by 4 inches, still intact with clean edges, backed with the original reflective coating. Back at his quarters, Kovac laid out the components on his footlocker. The mirror shard, electrical wire liberated from the communications section, and cloth tape from his personal kit. The design was simple because it had to be. The tailgun position was cramped, freezing at altitude, and violent during combat. Anything complex would fail. He needed the mirror positioned where he could angle it quickly without taking his hands off the guns. That meant mounting it directly on the gun assembly where a slight movement of the entire gun would move the mirror. He needed it adjustable so he could fine-tune the reflection angle. And he needed it secure enough that it wouldn't shake loose from gun recoil or vibration. The solution was crude but functional. He used the electrical wire to create a flexible mount attached to the left side of the gun frame. The wire was stiff enough to hold position but flexible enough to adjust. The mirror fragment was secured with multiple wraps of cloth tape, creating a backing that would prevent shattering from vibration. The entire assembly weighed maybe 6 ounces and cost approximately 35 cents in materials, though technically everything was already government property. So the actual cost was 0. The physics were straightforward. Sunlight hits a reflective surface at an incident angle and bounces off at an equal reflection angle. By positioning the mirror to catch direct sunlight and angling it toward an approaching aircraft, you could direct a concentrated beam of reflected light directly into the pilot's eyes. The sun's intensity at 20,000 feet was approximately 1,000 watts per square meter. A 6-inch mirror could reflect roughly 0.024 square meters worth of that energy. About 24 watts of light concentrated into a beam, maybe 2 feet in diameter, at 500 yards distance. That might not sound like much, but the human eye has evolved to protect itself from intense light through involuntary reflexes. When approximately 20 milliwatts of light hit the retina, the pupil contracts reflexively, and the eyelid begins to close. A sudden flash of 24 watts, over 1,000 times the threshold, would trigger immediate blink response, temporary vision impairment, and loss of target acquisition. It's the same principle behind blinding flashlights and laser dazzlers, just using the sun as the power source. Kovac tested the assembly the next morning before the mission brief. He positioned himself in the tailgun compartment while the aircraft sat on the hard stand, angled the mirror to catch the rising sun, and directed the reflection toward a water tower 300 yards away. The bright spot was clearly visible even at that distance. A concentrated circle of light intense enough to make him squint when he accidentally caught the edge of the reflection. "That'll work," he muttered. The question was whether he could use it in combat, at altitude with a maneuvering target, while potentially under fire himself, and whether it would actually affect a Zero pilot enough to disrupt an attack. The mirror modification violated at least 3 Army Air Force's regulations. Modifying aircraft equipment without authorization was prohibited under Article 108 of military regulations. Installing unauthorized equipment in combat aircraft violated safety protocols, and using any device that could potentially interfere with gun operation during combat was grounds for court-martial. Kovac considered this for approximately 5 seconds, then decided he'd rather be alive and court-martialed than dead and regulation-compliant. He installed the mirror assembly on Dixie's Delight during pre-flight on August 17th. The crew chief spotted it immediately. "Kovac, what in the hell is that thing?" "Insurance," Kovac replied. "If it doesn't work, I'll remove it after the mission." Torres looked at the mirror, looked at Kovac, then shook his head. "Your funeral, Sergeant. But if it falls off and jams your guns, I'm telling the old man it was your idea." Fair enough. 6 hours later, over the Solomon Sea, Danny Kovac would prove that sometimes the best military innovation comes not from research labs or tactical doctrine committees, but from a desperate man with broken glass and a half-remembered lesson about how light bounces. The formation crossed the Solomon Sea at 18,000 feet under scattered clouds that did nothing to provide cover and everything to create patches of shadow where Zero fighters could hide. 11 B-24 Liberators in a tight defensive box, each aircraft positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Dixie's Delight flew in the number 6 position, middle of the formation, which should have been safe but never was. Danny Kovac had been at his tailgun position for 3 hours, scanning the sky behind the formation, watching for the distinctive profile of Japanese fighters. The oxygen mask made his face itch. The temperature at altitude hovered around -20 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that the guns needed to be cleared periodically to prevent freezing. And the mirror assembly mounted to his gun frame caught the sunlight periodically, sending flashes of light dancing across the interior of the tail compartment. At 0947 hours, the radio crackled. "Bandits, high and behind the formation. Count 4, no, 6 contacts. Looks like Zero's climbing." Kovac swiveled his guns upward and back, searching the sky, nothing yet. But he knew the pattern. They'd climb above the formation, position themselves, then attack when the angle was right. He checked the sun's position, behind and above them, exactly where attacking fighters would want it. "They're setting up for sun runs," he said over the intercom. "Tail gunners, you're not going to see them until they're close. What are we supposed to do? Shoot blind?" That was the tail gunner on Lucky Strike, aircraft number 8. Kovac didn't answer. His hand moved to the mirror mount, adjusting it slightly. He'd practiced the movement a dozen times during the flight, learning how to angle the reflective surface while keeping his right hand on the gun triggers. The physics required precision. Catch the sunlight, angle it toward the attack vector, maintain the reflection while tracking the target. "Bandits inbound! 4 Zeros diving from 6 o'clock high!" Kovac looked up into the sun and saw nothing but blinding light and dark shapes that could have been aircraft or spots in his vision. Every instinct said to look away, to protect his eyes from the glare. Instead, he tilted the mirror assembly into the direct sunlight and adjusted the angle, directing the reflection back toward where the attackers had to be. The effect was immediate. One of the dark shapes wavered, the dive angle shifting from smooth to erratic. Kovac fine-tuned the mirror, keeping the reflection steady. The Zero was at 800 yards now, close enough that he should be seeing muzzle flashes from its guns. But the fighter was veering left, the pilot clearly struggling with something. At 600 yards, the Zero pulled out of its dive completely, banking hard right and climbing away without firing a shot. The other 3 Zeros continued their attacks on different bombers, but the one that had been lined up on Dixie's Delight was gone, the pilot abandoning the run. "What the hell?" Jimmy Chen's voice crackled over the intercom. "That Zero just broke off. He had a perfect shot, and he just left." Kovac didn't have time to explain. A second Zero was repositioning, climbing back into the sun for another run. He tracked it with the mirror, catching sunlight and directing it toward the climbing fighter. This time, he could see the effect more clearly. The Zero wobbled slightly, then changed its climb angle, moving away from Dixie's Delight toward another bomber. "They're avoiding us," Kovac said quietly. "They can't see to aim." The third Zero that came at them wasn't as cautious or as experienced. It dove from the sun, but held its course even when Kovac hit it with reflected light. Either the pilot was tougher or more determined. But determination doesn't help when you're temporarily blinded and trying to aim guns at 300 miles per hour. The Zero's cannon fire went wide, tracers streaming past the tail at least 15 feet off target. And the moment the fighter passed out of the sun's glare, now silhouetted against clear sky, Kovac was on the triggers. His twin .50 calibers hammered, tracer rounds walking across the Zero's fuselage. The fighter's engine erupted in black smoke. It rolled inverted and began spiraling toward the ocean. Tail gun? Confirm kill. That was the pilot, Major Robert Hastings, disbelief clear in his voice. Confirmed. 1-0 destroyed. 2 others broke off their runs. Over the next 20 minutes, the formation fought through 3 more waves of Zero attacks. Each time fighters approached Dixie's Delight from a sun-masked position, Kovac used the mirror to disrupt their aim. 2 more Zeros broke off entirely. One pressed the attack but took cannon fire so erratic it missed by dozens of feet, allowing Kovac to line up a clean shot when the fighter cleared the sun. Second, confirmed kill. By the time the formation reached Rabaul and dropped their bombs, word was spreading over the radio. Number 6 aircraft has some kind of trick. Zeros can't hit her from the sun. The flight back was quieter. Japanese fighters had expended their fuel and ammunition. But in the debriefing room at Port Moresby, the questions came fast. How had Dixie's Delight avoided damage from sun attacks that had crippled 2 other bombers? How had Kovac shot down 2 Zeros, attacking from positions where he shouldn't have been able to see them? Kovac pulled the mirror assembly from his flight bag and set it on the debriefing table. 75 cents worth of broken glass and some wire. When they come out of the sun, I put the sun in their eyes instead. They can't aim when they're blinded. The debriefing officer stared at the crude device. That's unauthorized equipment modification. Yes, sir. It is. You could be court-martialed. Yes, sir, I could. Major Hastings spoke up. Or you could be saving lives. How many bombers did we lose today to sun attacks? 2 confirmed, 1 probable. And how many times did Zeros attack our aircraft from the sun? 6 times. And how many of those attacks were successful? Silence. Then, none, sir. Hastings picked up the mirror assembly, turning it over in his hands. Get me Colonel Strauss. I think he needs to see this. The official response to Kovac's mirror modification was bureaucratic paralysis, wrapped in tactical skepticism. Colonel Thomas Strauss, commanding officer of the 90th Bombardment Group, looked at the crude assembly of glass and wire with the expression of a man who'd been handed a live grenade with the pin already pulled. On one hand, regulations clearly prohibited unauthorized equipment modifications. On the other hand, one of his aircraft had just survived 6 unattack attempts without taking a single hit. You understand this violates at least 4 separate regulations, Strauss said, not looking at Kovac, but at the mirror. Equipment modification, unauthorized installation, potential safety hazard, deviation from standard defensive protocols. Yes, sir. And you installed it anyway. I did, sir. Why? Kovac chose his words carefully. Sir, we've lost 17 aircraft in 6 months to sun attacks. That's 170 men. I watched my best friend's bomber go down in February to a Zero attack nobody saw coming because the sun was in their eyes. I figured a court-martial was worth it if it meant some of those 170 men got to go home instead. Strauss was quiet for a long moment. Then, Major Hastings says you shot down 2 Zeros, both from sun-masked positions where the tail gunner should have been blind. The mirror doesn't help you see them, sir. It disrupts their vision so they can't aim. Once they're past the sun angle, you can track them normally. And you came up with this yourself? Nobody authorized this. Nobody helped design it? I grew up around mirrors and optics, sir. Hardware store in Cleveland. Just applied what I learned to the problem. Strauss set the mirror down. Here's what's going to happen, Sergeant. Officially, I'm confiscating this unauthorized device and reminding you that equipment modifications require approval through proper channels. Unofficially, I'm going to have our technical officer examine this and determine if it actually works or if today was a fluke. Yes, sir. And Kovac, if this turns out to be legitimate, if it actually saves lives, you'll get a commendation. If it turns out you got lucky and this thing falls off and jams someone's guns, you'll get a court-martial. Clear? Crystal clear, sir. But word had already spread through the group faster than official channels could contain it. By evening, every tail gunner in the 90th knew that Kovac had shot down 2 Zeros using some kind of mirror trick. By the next morning, 3 other gunners had approached him, asking how to build one. By the afternoon, crew chiefs were quietly finding broken mirrors and scrap wire. The official technical evaluation took 4 days. Captain Eugene Walsh, the group's technical officer, was thorough and skeptical in equal measure. He tested the mirror assembly on the ground, measuring light intensity at various angles. He consulted with the group flight surgeon about the physiological effects of sudden bright light on pilot vision. He interviewed Kovac extensively about the exact mechanics of how he'd use the device during combat. His official report, filed August 24th, was cautiously positive. The official response to Kovac's mirror modification was bureaucratic paralysis, wrapped in tactical skepticism. Colonel Thomas Strauss, commanding officer of the 90th Bombardment Group, looked at the crude assembly of glass and wire with the expression of a man who'd been handed a live grenade with the pin already pulled. On one hand, regulations clearly prohibited unauthorized equipment modifications. On the other hand, one of his aircraft had just survived 6 unattack attempts without taking a single hit. "You understand this violates at least 4 separate regulations," Strauss said, not looking at Kovac, but at the mirror. "Equipment modification, unauthorized installation, potential safety hazard, deviation from standard defensive protocols." "Yes, sir. And you installed it anyway." "I did, sir." "Why?" Kovac chose his words carefully. "Sir, we've lost 17 aircraft in 6 months to sun attacks. That's 170 men. I watched my best friend's bomber go down in February to a Zero attack nobody saw coming because the sun was in their eyes. I figured a court-martial was worth it if it meant some of those 170 men got to go home instead." Strauss was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Major Hastings says you shot down 2 Zeros, both from sun-masked positions where the tail gunner should have been blind. The mirror doesn't help you see them, sir. It disrupts their vision so they can't aim. Once they're past the sun angle, you can track them normally. And you came up with this yourself? Nobody authorized this. Nobody helped design it? I grew up around mirrors and optics, sir. Hardware store in Cleveland. Just applied what I learned to the problem." Strauss set the mirror down. "Here's what's going to happen, Sergeant. Officially, I'm confiscating this unauthorized device and reminding you that equipment modifications require approval through proper channels. Unofficially, I'm going to have our technical officer examine this and determine if it actually works or if today was a fluke." "Yes, sir. And Kovac, if this turns out to be legitimate, if it actually saves lives, you'll get a commendation. If it turns out you got lucky and this thing falls off and jams someone's guns, you'll get a court-martial. Clear? Crystal clear, sir." But word had already spread through the group faster than official channels could contain it. By evening, every tail gunner in the 90th knew that Kovac had shot down 2 Zeros using some kind of mirror trick. By the next morning, 3 other gunners had approached him, asking how to build one. By the afternoon, crew chiefs were quietly finding broken mirrors and scrap wire. The official technical evaluation took 4 days. Captain Eugene Walsh, the group's technical officer, was thorough and skeptical in equal measure. He tested the mirror assembly on the ground, measuring light intensity at various angles. He consulted with the group flight surgeon about the physiological effects of sudden bright light on pilot vision. He interviewed Kovac extensively about the exact mechanics of how he'd use the device during combat. His official report, filed August 24th, was cautiously positive. The mirror assembly demonstrates measurable capability to redirect solar radiation toward attacking aircraft. While unorthodox, the device exploits a documented vulnerability in Japanese sun attack tactics. Recommend controlled field testing with volunteer crews before broader implementation. But the unofficial adoption had already begun. By the time Walsh filed his report, 8 bombers in the 90th Bombardment Group had mirror assemblies installed by their tail gunners. The designs varied. Some used larger mirrors, others experimented with multiple reflective surfaces, but the principle was identical. Bounce the sun back at the attackers. The first confirmation came on August 23rd during a raid on WWII. Staff Sergeant Marcus Peterson. The mirror modification's journey from unauthorized innovation to officially sanctioned equipment would take 6 months, 3 separate investigations, and a casualty rate that finally forced headquarters to acknowledge what the combat crews already knew. It worked. But institutional military bureaucracy doesn't change easily, even when lives are on the line. The first formal challenge came in October 1943, when a safety investigation was triggered by a mirror fragment that detached during combat, though it caused no damage, and the gunner simply reinstalled it after landing. The investigation officer, Captain Morris Feldman from 5th Air Force Headquarters, arrived at Port Moresby with orders to evaluate unauthorized equipment modifications, creating potential flight safety hazards. Feldman's initial report was damning. The mirrors were not manufactured to military specifications. Installation procedures were inconsistent across aircraft. No formal testing had been conducted under controlled conditions. The modifications had never been approved by the Bureau of Aeronautics. His preliminary recommendation was immediate removal of all mirror assemblies and formal reprimand for personnel who'd installed them. Then Feldman flew a combat mission. As a rated officer, he was authorized to fly as an observer, and he chose to position himself in the tail gun compartment of a B-24 named Hellcat during a raid on Rabaul. The tail gunner, Sergeant David Cohen, had a mirror installed and gave Feldman a practical demonstration when 3 Zeros attacked from the sun. Feldman watched as Cohen used the mirror to disrupt the first attack, forcing the Zero to break off. He watched the second Zero persist despite the reflected glare and get shot down when its cannon fire went wide. And he watched the third Zero abandon its approach entirely when hit with the reflected sunlight, the pilot apparently unwilling to risk the temporary blindness. Feldman's revised report, filed October 18th, was considerably different. While the mirror assemblies do not meet standard equipment specifications, their combat effectiveness is undeniable. Recommend formal evaluation for potential standardization rather than prohibition. But resistance remained. The Army Air Force's Materiel Command argued that allowing field-expedient modifications set dangerous precedents. If mirrors were permitted, what would prevent other unauthorized changes that might actually compromise safety? The Ordnance Department insisted that any defensive equipment should be manufactured to specifications, not cobbled together from scrap. The debate might have continued indefinitely if not for a single combat mission on November 12, 1943. A formation of 16 B-24s from 3 different bombardment groups encountered a coordinated Zero attack over New Britain. 8 bombers had mirror-equipped tail gunners. 8 did not. The results were stark. Of the 8 bombers without mirrors, 4 were damaged by sun attacks and 1 was shot down. Of the 8 bombers with mirrors, none sustained damage from sun attacks, and their tail gunners collectively shot down 3 Zeros that attempted the tactic. The statistical analysis was irrefutable. The probability that this result was a coincidence was less than 2%. The mirrors worked, and they worked consistently enough to show clear survival benefits. General Kenny personally reviewed the report and made a decision that bypassed months of bureaucratic debate. On November 30, 1943, he issued 5th Air Force Tactical Bulletin 4318, Anti-Sun Attack Defensive Measures. The bulletin didn't mandate mirror installation, but it officially authorized it as a field-expedient defensive modification permitted at group commander discretion. It was the military equivalent of grudging acceptance. We won't order you to do this, but we won't stop you either. For the combat crews, it was enough. By December, nearly 70% of heavy bombers in the 5th Air Force had some form of mirror installation. But Kenny went a step further. He ordered the Air Technical Service Command to develop a standardized mirror assembly that could be manufactured and installed consistently. The result was the ANM-2 Anti-Glare Tactical Mirror, a formal designation for what was essentially Kovac's original design, refined with better mounting hardware and higher quality mirror material. The ANM-2 entered production in January 1944. It was a small rectangular mirror, 6 inches by 4 inches, with an adjustable mount designed to attach to .50 caliber gun assemblies without interfering with gun operation. Total unit cost, $2.75. Total manufacturing time, approximately 15 minutes. It was perhaps the cheapest piece of combat equipment the Army Air Forces would produce during the entire war. Installation became part of standard bomber configuration. Gunners received formal training in mirror use, how to angle for maximum effect, how to maintain reflection while tracking targets, how to transition from blinding to shooting when the enemy cleared the sun angle. What had been an improvised trick became codified doctrine. The Japanese tried to adapt. Some pilots attempted to attack from sun angles so extreme that reflected light couldn't reach them. Others tried rapid jinking during the dive to make mirror aiming difficult. But the fundamental problem remained. If you attacked from the sun, American gunners could now use that sun against you. The tactic that had been nearly unstoppable in early 1943 had become dangerous by mid-1944. Casualty statistics told the story. In the 6 months before mirror adoption, February-July 1943, the 5th Air Force lost 42 heavy bombers to sun attacks. In the 6 months after widespread adoption, December 1943, May 1944, they lost 7. The Japanese hadn't stopped trying the tactic. They just stopped succeeding at it. By June 1944, the mirror modification had spread beyond the Pacific. 8th Air Force bombers over Europe began installing them after intelligence reports indicated Luftwaffe pilots were experimenting with sun attacks similar to Japanese tactics. The modification that had started as one sergeant's desperate innovation had become standard equipment across the entire U.S. Army Air Forces. And Danny Kovac, the man who'd started it all with 75 cents worth of broken glass, received official recognition in the form of the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement in aerial combat and innovative contributions to defensive tactics. The citation carefully avoided mentioning that his innovation had been completely unauthorized at the time. He received the medal in a quiet ceremony at Port Moresby in February 1944, then went back to his tailgun position for another mission. There was still a war to fight, and mirrors or not, the Japanese kept coming. Rabaul was the fortress the Japanese swore would never fall, a massive naval and air base on the eastern tip of New Britain Island, protected by 5 airfields, hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, and a fighter force that peaked at nearly 400 aircraft. Between October 1943 and February 1944, the U.S. 5th Air Force flew continuous raids against Rabaul, trying to neutralize it as a threat. These missions would become the ultimate test of the mirror modification under sustained, intense combat conditions. The January 14, 1944 raid was typical of the Rabaul campaign's intensity. 24 B-24 liberators from the 90th and 43rd Bombardment Groups approached the target at 22,000 feet, knowing they'd face swarms of Zeros from multiple airfields. Intelligence estimated at least 60 fighters would intercept the formation. Every bomber had mirror-equipped tail gunners. They'd need them. The Japanese defenders had learned about the mirrors by this point. Captured documents and pilot debriefs had revealed the American light weapon. Their response was to throw so many fighters at the formations that mirrors couldn't save everyone. The mathematics was brutal. If 20 Zeros attacked simultaneously from multiple angles, the bombers couldn't possibly defend against all of them, mirrors or not. The first wave hit at 10:15 hours. 15 Zeros climbed above the formation, spreading out to attack from different sun angles simultaneously. The bomber gunners used their mirrors, creating multiple beams of reflected light that scattered across the sky like searchlights. Some Zeros broke off immediately. Others pressed through, their pilots squinting against the glare, firing blind and hoping to hit something. Danny Kovac, flying his 47th combat mission, tracked 3 different Zeros attempting sun runs on Dixie's Delight. The first one he blinded completely. The fighter pulled off without firing a shot. The second pressed the attack, but its fire went wide, cannon shells passing harmlessly above the bomber's tail. Kovac shot it down as it cleared the sun angle, watching the Zero's wing tear away under 50 caliber fire. The third Zero was flown by either a veteran or a fanatic. It dove through the reflected sunlight without deviation, holding course, even though the pilot had to be temporarily blinded. The fighter's guns opened up at 500 yards, firing along its last known heading toward where the bomber should be. Pure luck and skill put some rounds into Dixie's Delight. Several cannon shells punched through the left stabilizer, and one .30 caliber round cracked through the tail compartment 6 inches from Kovac's head. But the Zero's fire wasn't concentrated enough to cause critical damage. And the moment it passed, the sun angle Kovac hammered it with a 3-second burst that tore through the fighter's cockpit. The Zero rolled lazily and fell away trailing smoke. Across the formation, the pattern repeated. Zeros attempted sun attacks, got blinded by mirrors, and either broke off or pressed through with degraded accuracy. Some still scored hits. The mirrors weren't magic, and determined or lucky pilots could still do damage. But the kill rate had inverted. Before mirrors, sun attacks succeeded about 60% of the time. Now they succeeded perhaps 15% of the time. And even successful attacks rarely achieved the catastrophic first-pass kills that had made the tactic so deadly. The January 14th raid lost 2 bombers, but neither was to sun attacks. One took concentrated fire from a head-on attack. The other suffered mechanical failure and ditched in the ocean. Crew rescued. Of the 60-plus sun attack attempts during the mission, only 3 achieved any hits, and none resulted in a bomber loss. The February 6th mission pushed the mirrors to their absolute limit. 30 B-24s hit Rabaul's Gunacanao airfield in the face of the heaviest fighter resistance of the campaign. Over 90 Zeros intercepted the formation, attacking in continuous waves for 40 minutes. The tail gunners used their mirrors so extensively that some reported sunspots in their vision for hours afterward from the constant reflected glare. Kovac's aircraft faced 11 separate attack attempts, 8 from sun-masked positions. He used the mirror on every one, creating a defensive barrier of reflected light that turned the bomber's tail into a zone Japanese pilots learned to avoid. When Zeros did attack from other angles, Kovac's hands were free to use his guns normally. The mirror only came into play for sun attacks. The mission lost 4 bombers, a heavy toll but far less than the predicted casualties based on the fighter strength encountered. Post-mission analysis estimated the formation had faced approximately 140 separate attack runs. Of those, roughly 80 were sun attacks. The mirrors disrupted or defeated approximately 65 of them. The math was stark. Without mirrors, the estimated loss rate for that mission would have been 12 to 15 bombers. With mirrors, they lost 4. By March 1944, Rabaul's fighter strength had been so degraded by combat losses that the Japanese began evacuating aircraft to safer bases. The sustained bombing campaign had worked, but the bombers that made it work had survived largely because of a defensive innovation that turned the enemy's tactical advantage into a vulnerability. The final accounting of the Rabaul campaign showed the mirror modification's full impact. Between October 1943 and March 1944, 5th Air Force bombers flew 616 combat missions against Rabaul. They faced an estimated 4,800 individual fighter attack attempts, with approximately 2,900 of those being sun attacks. Of the 68 bombers lost during the campaign, only 8 were attributed to sun attacks, down from what historical models suggested would have been closer to 40-50 losses if the pre-mirror casualty rates had held. That translated directly to lives saved. Each bomber lost meant 10 men dead, missing, or captured. The mirror modification, by preventing approximately 30-40 bomber losses to sun attacks, had saved between 300 and 400 airmen's lives during the Rabaul campaign alone. Across the entire Pacific theater and the broader war, the estimates were higher. Over 1,500 lives saved by a defensive innovation that cost $2.75 per aircraft. The Japanese never developed an effective counter to the mirrors. Some pilots tried to adapt their tactics, attacking from different angles or using clouds for concealment. But the fundamental advantage of the sun attack had been neutralized, and with it went one of the Zero's most reliable methods for killing American bombers. One captured Japanese pilot, interviewed after the war, summed it up simply: "We knew the Americans had found a way to use light against us. We were told to avoid the flash, but sometimes you had no choice. And when the light hit you, you couldn't see, couldn't aim. It was like fighting blind." That was exactly what American gunners had faced for the first 2 years of the Pacific War, fighting blind against sun attacks. Danny Kovac's mirror had given them their sight back. The war ended in August 1945, and with it, the urgent need for defensive innovations against Japanese fighters. But the mirror modification's legacy extended far beyond the combat it was designed for. What started as one sergeant's desperate improvisation became a case study in military innovation. Proof that sometimes the best solutions come from the battlefield rather than the laboratory. The official recognition came slowly but definitively. In November 1945, the Army Air Forces published Technical Order Umbohrungsumwindung, Defensive Optical Countermeasures, which formally codified the mirror assembly as standard equipment for bomber tailgun positions. The document acknowledged that the innovation had originated from field observations and crew-level experimentation, rather than formal research. Military bureaucracy's way of admitting the troops had figured it out first. Danny Kovac mustered out of service in October 1945 as a Master Sergeant with the Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 air medals, and a quiet footnote in official histories that few people would ever read. He returned to Cleveland, married his high school sweetheart, and took a job at the same hardware store where old Mr. Henrik had taught him about mirrors and light. He rarely talked about the war, but the doctrine he'd changed lived on. The principle of using directed light as a defensive or offensive tool became embedded in military thinking. When the Army Air Forces became the independent U.S. Air Force in 1947, the new service's tactical manuals included sections on optical countermeasures. The mirror modification itself became obsolete, as aircraft technology advanced beyond the tailgun bomber. But the thinking behind it didn't. The Korean War saw limited use of mirror assemblies on the B-29 superfortresses that flew night missions against North Korean targets. While jet fighters had largely replaced the prop-driven aircraft that had made sun attacks viable, the mirrors were kept as backup defensive equipment. A few tailgunners reported using them successfully against nighttime searchlight positions, turning the enemy's light source back on them to disrupt anti-aircraft targeting. By Vietnam, the concept had evolved into laser designation and anti-laser countermeasures. The physics were more complex, the technology more sophisticated, but the fundamental idea remained. Control the light spectrum, and you control a dimension of combat. Military researchers developing laser rangefinders and later laser-guided weapons cited the mirror modification as an early example of directed energy concepts in practical combat use. The academic recognition came even later. A 1978 Air Force historical study titled Grassroots Innovation in Combat, Case Studies from World War II devoted an entire chapter to the mirror modification. The study analyzed how field-level innovations often outpaced formal doctrine in addressing immediate tactical problems. Kovac was interviewed for the study, one of the few times he spoke publicly about his wartime experience. It wasn't genius, he told the researchers. It was just physics and desperation. The Japanese had figured out how to use the sun as a weapon. I just figured out how to use it as a shield. If I'd had time to go through proper channels, get approval, wait for testing and evaluation, a lot more men would have died. Sometimes you can't wait for permission to save lives. That quote became foundational in military innovation studies. The Kovac principle, as some researchers termed it, held that combat effectiveness should sometimes override procedural compliance, and that innovations proven under fire deserved rapid evaluation rather than bureaucratic dismissal. It was cited in arguments for faster weapons development cycles, field testing protocols, and even modern rapid prototyping initiatives. The mirror modification saved an estimated 1,500 to 2,000 lives during World War II, a number that's difficult to quantify precisely because it measures deaths that didn't happen. Statistical models based on pre-mirror casualty rates versus post-mirror rates suggest that's a conservative estimate. The actual number could be higher. In 1993, the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum acquired one of the original ANM-2 mirror assemblies for its collection. It sits in a climate-controlled archive alongside other World War II innovations. The Norden bomb sight, the cavity magnetron that enabled radar, and the proximity fuse. A small placard notes, "This simple device, improvised by a tailgunner using scrap materials, revolutionized bomber defensive tactics and saved hundreds of lives." Danny Kovac died in 2003 at the age of 81. His obituary in the Cleveland Plain Dealer mentioned his World War II service, but not his specific contribution. A few aviation historians noticed and wrote remembrances, but the general public largely missed the passing of a man whose improvisation had changed the air war. His surviving family donated his personal effects to the Air Force Historical Research Agency. Among them was the original mirror fragment from that first mission over the Solomon Sea in August 1943, a 6-inch piece of silvered glass wrapped in faded electrical tape and cloth, surprisingly intact after 60 years. A handwritten note tucked with it read, "First mirror, August 17, 1943. It worked." The broader legacy is less tangible, but more important. The mirror modification proved that military innovation doesn't require advanced degrees, million-dollar research budgets, or years of development. Sometimes it requires a sharp mind, practical experience, and the willingness to try something that violates regulations but solves the problem. Modern military innovation programs explicitly look for Kovac moments, instances where frontline personnel identify problems that formal doctrine hasn't addressed and develop solutions using available resources. Special Operations Command runs exercises where teams are given tactical problems and minimal resources, specifically to encourage the kind of improvised innovation Kovac demonstrated. The Air Force Academy includes the mirror modification in its military history curriculum as an example of tactical innovation under pressure. Cadets study the casualty rates before and after adoption, the resistance from bureaucracy, and the eventual acceptance when the data becomes undeniable. It's a case study in how institutional military structures can both enable and obstruct innovation. And somewhere in Air Force archives, there's still a technical order authorizing mirror assemblies for defensive use. Obsolete, never rescinded. A bureaucratic fossil from an era when bomber tail gunners fought Zeros with 50 caliber guns and broken glass. It's a small reminder that the best military innovations sometimes come not from laboratories or test ranges, but from desperate men who refuse to accept impossible odds. Danny Kovac took 75 cents worth of scrap material and turned the sun itself into a weapon. In doing so, he proved that ingenuity, courage, and a basic understanding of physics could change the course of battles and save thousands of lives. The technology moved on. The tactics evolved. But the principle endures. When doctrine fails, when equipment isn't enough, when men are dying because the enemy has found an advantage you can't match, innovation doesn't ask for permission. It acts, it adapts, and it survives. That's the legacy of the mirror flash trick, not the mirrors themselves, which became obsolete within a decade, but the reminder that the deadliest weapon in any military arsenal is the human mind refusing to accept defeat.